In our next section, we're going to look at how the backup policies work of UCS and what are the different types of backups that we can do in terms of the full state versus the system configuration, the logical configuration. We'll look at exporting the backups to a remote server and then look at the process both from importing the configuration and then also doing a disaster recovery when we're starting from essentially a blank config, like we're trying to replace one of the fabric interconnects physically, and then we're doing the restoration from the console. Now, specifically from the UCS manager, UCS backups are going to be under admin general and then backup configuration, and we'll see that there's going to be 4 different types of backup files that we can create, where the first of which is the full state. Full state is going to be a binary file that is only used during disaster recovery. So let's say that you're going from UCS 6200s to 6300s, or you're going from an old fabric interconnect that fails, you had to RMA it, comes back in, now you're trying to restore the configuration. So in this case, it's going to be a full one-to-one replica of the old configuration to the new configuration. So you do need to make sure that the version number is correct first, that you did the backup file from, and that you are restoring it onto. Okay, as opposed to system configuration and logical configuration, this is going to be what you would think of as the actual config of the system. So the usernames, the organizations, the locales, in the case of multi-tenancy, is going to be under the system config. Logical configuration is going to be anything that is the service profile related, and then also the LAN and the SAN connectivity. So what VLANs we have, maybe disjoint layer 2 in terms of VLAN membership, VLAN groups, all the SAN config, the virtual HBAs, the vSANs, the pinning, etc. And then the all configuration, hence the name, is going to be a combination of all of this. Okay, so both the system configuration and the logical configuration at the same time. Pretty much the only thing that the all config doesn't save is the passwords that are associated with the usernames. And so if you want to restore the user database from the old FIs to the new ones, then you have to use the full state, which again is the binary backup. It's basically your do a write erase reload equivalent in the fabric interconnects, and then you can restore from the full state. Okay, so let's look at the creation of these. So again, this is going to be from the UCSM under admin and then general. So here we have the new interface for the 3.1.3 release. So on the left, we're going to go under admin, and then we're going to go to under backup configuration. Okay, so backup configuration and import configuration. Okay, so we're going to go to backup, and then we're going to create a backup operation, and it says what type do we want it to be. Okay, so in this case, what I'm going to do for the first example is we'll go through all configuration first, because we can simply export that and import that back in, whereas the full state, we're going to have to erase the box, reload it, and then restore it from the full state backup, so it's going to be more time consuming. So let's go ahead and save the config now. We're going to export it to our remote TFTP server, make some changes in terms of like service profiles, VLANs, vSANs, in terms of the logical configuration. Then we'll import the configuration back, and we should see that it rolls back those additional changes. Okay, so first we're going to say that we want to create a backup operation. Again, what type is this going to be? Okay, it's going to be all configuration. Admin state is enabled. And it says preserve identities. If preserve identities is checked, the port worldwide names, MAC addresses, etc., are going to be staying the same when they get installed into the backup. So basically it means that if you have like a PWWN pool, and we have a service profile instance that was created from our template calling the pool, once we go to instantiate the actual instance of the profile, it's grabbing an address from the logical pools, and then we're doing other configuration based off that, like zoning, LUN masking on the storage array. So if we export that config, we import it back in later to the same service profile, there's a high possibility that we want to make sure that those numbers stay the same, because otherwise it would affect the zoning config and the LUN masking. So normally you would just check the box here that says preserve identities. If you don't do that, it means that when it reinstalls the config and then goes to deploy the service profile, it would have to release the addresses from the pools, and in the vast majority of cases, the end result is that it's going to have a different value. Okay, so hopefully kind of self-explanatory. If you want the numbers to stay the same, then check preserve identities. Okay, so we're going to a remote file system. We have a TFTP server on the management segment, which is 192.168.0.2, and we'll say that this is going to be, and it said here, note that this must be in XML format. So we'll say that this is going to be UCS1 dash all, or let's say dot all config dot XML. Okay, status is success. So this should be pretty much immediately that it's going to be fairly quickly to do the like a TFTP operation of the either all config, system config, or logical configuration. Okay, so let me go to my backup server, to the TFTP server, and let's make sure that the changes actually got installed here. Okay, so this is a Linux box that I have on the management segment. So under my directory FTP root, let's say ls, and I want to store it by date. Okay, so the last backup here was UCS1 all config.xml. It's about 130K, so it's a fairly small file in the scheme of things. Okay, so let's say that we're going to make some changes now to the FIs. And these changes are going to be some sort of logical configuration change. So we're going to, let's say we go and create a new service profile. So let's go under servers, and under service profiles, okay, we have Brian instance number 1. Okay, let's right click this and then let's create a clone of it. And we'll say that this is going to be our new SP1, okay, under org root. Okay, successfully created a clone. Okay, we see our new service profile. Okay, so what we should now see is that if we do the import of the configuration, that this is no longer going to be there. So let's go back to our admin tab, and then we're going to import the configuration. Okay, we're going to create an import operation, and it says, what's the action for the config? Do you want to replace the config or merge the config? Okay, in this case, I want to replace the config. So we're going to say admin state is enabled. It's coming from remote TFTP server. Host name is 192.168.0.2. And then our remote file was ucs1.all.config.xml. Let me make sure that's the right file name. ucs1 all.config.xml. Okay, so okay. Created the import operation. So status right now is in progress. Okay, so let's log back in now. And what we should see changed is that under servers, under service profiles, we should see that that new profile 1 got deleted. Because again, key point being here that I was replacing the config as opposed to merging the config. Merging the config would have just overwritten the differences between them as opposed to deleting objects, okay, which in this case should be deleted an object. So let's go under servers, and then under service profiles. Okay, so now notice we see Brian instance 1 through 8, but we don't see that new service profile. Okay, so hopefully pretty straightforward in this case. What is a little bit confusing about this is going to be what are the different types, the all configuration versus the system config and the logical config. But just based on the naming convention, I mean, it should be self-explanatory. All config means all of the config. Okay, so now we're going to look at doing a full state backup. Okay, so we're going to create another operation. And I'm not 100% sure about this version because I haven't tried this yet, but in the old version, you ran into kind of a bug here that if you already had the TFTP server or the SFTP server, so whatever the IP address is, if you already had this created as a backup operation, you would have to delete the old one and then recreate it. So let's try just adding another one here and see if it's going to complain. So let's say that this is enabled, this is going to be full state, and we're going to go to TFTP to 192.168.0.2, and remote file is in XML format. So let's say that this is going to be the UCS1 full state config.xml. There was a duplicate object. Yeah, so we run into the same problem here. Basically, we need to delete the old operation, and then we can recreate this. So let's cancel out of here. And let's say that under our previous operation, we delete it. Okay, yes, I want to delete it. And then let's add another one. Okay, so enabled full state to TFTP 192.168.0.2. Remote file is going to be ucs1.full.state.config.xml. Okay, so it's creating the local config backup, and then ultimately it's going to export it out. So if we go back to the Linux box that is actually running the TFTP server, we should see in a second here that after UCS all config, we should get the binary config. Okay, so we now see status is success. So if we go back to the TFTP server, we should see that new file. Okay, so the full state config, and we can see it's quite bigger than the other files. So it's only about a megabyte total. So in the scheme of things, not really that big. But as compared to the all configuration, it's roughly 10 plus times the size. And really the key difference being here is that the full state configuration, you cannot import it from the UCS manager. Okay, you can only do it from the console when we do a full restoration. And let's go ahead and cat the file. So let's cat ucs1.fullstate.xml, type more. And you can see that this is a binary file. Okay, so even though from the UI it asked me to make it an XML file, it's actually not. Okay, so even though the extension is .xml, it's not actually XML. The other one we should be able to read in plain text, so the all config. So let's cat ucs1.all config XML. Okay, so you can see that, like, if you were to open this up in a web browser, you would see the XML format. Basically, it has the model names. If we were to search through this, like, let's cat this, and then let's say we'll grep for instance. Okay, and actually, I think it sees it all as one line from here. So, but we would see, you can see like the serial numbers of the servers are listed in there. Okay, so now let's look at how do we restore from the full state, which is going to be everything. So the main idea for this is that it's going to be for catastrophic system recovery. So the Fabric Interconnect completely crashes. We RMA it. We get a new one in from Cisco. We want to load the config onto it. And then if there's not already a primary member of the cluster, it doesn't have anywhere to grab the configuration from. So under normal circumstances, you have your active standby pair in terms of the management. If the primary one fails, the backup Fabric Interconnect promotes itself from secondary to primary, and it starts running the management interface. If you take a new FI and plug it in, what it's going to do when you connect the L1, L2 cables between the two of them, you start up the initial config dialog from the CLI. It's going to tell you, hey, I found the other Fabric Interconnect. Do I just want to join the cluster? And assuming that the version number is compatible between the two of them, that's pretty much all that you need to do. Okay, so for this example, what we're going to do is erase the config from the CLI, reboot the boxes, which again is going to be kind of time consuming, probably going to take maybe 10 minutes or so for them to fully reboot. And then once they come back, we'll look at how do we restore the full state configuration from the TFTP server. Okay, so in this case, we're going to go to the console of Fabric Interconnect A and B. Okay, and we're going to log in. So we're going to log in as admin. Okay, password in this case CCIDC01. And we're going to connect to local-mgmt, okay, local management. And then we say erase config. Okay, this is going to erase and reboot. Do you want to do this? Yes. Okay, this is the equivalent of write, erase, and reload. Okay, so eventually once this comes back from the console point of view, we're going to go back through the initial config dialog like we did in the very beginning of the class. And then instead of saying we want to set up a new Fabric Interconnect from the console, we're going to say restore. And then it's going to ask us what's the remote server, what's the IP address, what's the username and password. And then once it downloads the config file, we should see that the secondary fabric interconnect is going to auto-join, well, not necessarily auto-join the cluster, but it's going to find the cluster automatically and then ask us just for the password of the other end, and it's going to automatically download the config. So assuming that you're replacing your old pair of FIs with a new pair, then you only need to upload the full state backup onto one of them, and then the other one is just going to automatically join the cluster. Okay, so otherwise, let's go ahead and let this reboot again. We'll come back when we get back to our initial config dialog prompt, and then we'll continue here with restoring the full state backup. Okay, so now we're back to our initial configuration dialog. So the config is erased of the FIs and we're on the console. So like we saw previously, first thing it asks is how do we want to do the setup? So we're going through the console or the GUI. Okay, if we said the GUI, it's going to ask us the IP address that we want to use for management. So we're going to use the console. And do we want to set up or restore? In this case, we're going to do a restore. This is going to restore the fabric interconnect from a backup file, yes. What is the physical IP address? Okay, so we need a unique IP, 192.168.0.101 in this case. Netmask is /22, 22, so 255.252.0. Gateway 192.168.0.1. We're going to use TFTP as our protocol. Server is 192.168.0.2, and the file name again was ucs1.fullstateconfig.xml, I want to say. Let me double check from the Linux box. It is UCS1 full.state.config.xml, okay, which we have. Okay, retrieving the backup configuration file. Okay, so this means that it did get it from the TFTP server. And then we should see the end result is that it's going to send us back to the login prompt. Okay, now for the secondary fabric interconnect, when you're doing the initial config dialog, like I mentioned before, you have to make sure that they have the same version. They have to have compatible versions before they can join the cluster. In the newer code, there is a way to auto-sync the version from the primary FI down to the secondary FI, but in older versions that wasn't supported, so you'd have to manually set the fabric interconnect up on its own, upload the new image to it, make sure that the two match, then erase the config and rejoin the cluster in order to basically synchronize the config. Okay, in this case, they're both running the same version because we did the auto install previously at the same time between the two of them. But just be aware of that there can be issues if the major versions at least are not similar to each other. So configuration file, okay. We're waiting for it to go back to the login prompt before we go to the secondary box. Okay, so now that we're back at the login prompt, let's go to Fabric Interconnect B. And we're going to, in our configuration method is going to be the console. And then hopefully what it should say is that it found the peer Fabric Interconnect, okay, which it did. Installer has detected the presence of a peer Fabric Interconnect. Do we want to add it to the cluster? Yes. What is the password of the peer? And hopefully what we should see is this. Retrieving the config from the peer Fabric Interconnect is done. Okay, that's pretty much it. Okay, installer has determined that the peer Fabric Interconnect was restored from a backup. All the necessary information to add this FI to the cluster will be fetched from the peer Fabric Interconnect. So this really depends on what was the backup method that we had done to begin with. That if we had done a full configuration that doesn't include the configuration of the FIs themselves, okay, like the part numbers of the actual Fabric Interconnects, then it would ask us some additional questions like what's the IP address you want to use as the unique one, what's the password of the other guy. But otherwise, it's going to be pretty similar to what we saw in the initial config dialog to begin with. But the main takeaway from this section is that when we're talking about the difference between the 4 types of backups, full state is not for exporting and importing from the GUI. It's for exporting from the GUI and then importing from the console after you erase and reload the box. So the vast majority of the time when you're taking your normal day-to-day backups, those would be all configuration. And then you can schedule, say like every 24 hours, I want to automatically export the config. And we can schedule that depending on what the version is. As of 3.1 and later, you're able to schedule the backups. Previously, you had to manually go in there and do it.